And now from Adriatic Palace to Italy. I would like to present Serena de Dominicis. She's an art historian and independent art critic. She received 2 years ago her PhD in art history jointly from Toulouse Jean Jaurès University and the University of Rome Tor Vergata. Her thesis examined the relationship between contemporary art and the growth theory. De Dominicis was an editor of the magazine Arte Critica. Currently, she is collaborating with Centro Studi Maffei Raphael in Rome. And I would like to stress that this fact is very important for the audience, because now her main area of her research is the heritage by Antonietta Raphael Maffei, an important Italian modernist artist who was born in Kaunas. So the floor is yours. The title of presentation, Rationalism and Fascism, the Italian Experience.
Hello to everybody. First of all, I would like to thank Professor Jankovic-Schutte for inviting me today. My contribution introduced the Italian case in the debate on the influence of modern nationalism on integral modernism, focusing on the role of art and raising the issue of the public perception of the debate between architecture and memory today. Introduced in Italy around 1926, 10 years after Northern Europe, Italian rationalism co-occurred, as you know, with the 2 decades of the fascist regime. The relation with contemporary national art and culture, mainly the reactionary Novecento style and the Mussolinian vision, only partially highlights its characteristics. Italian rationalism definitely ranges between European modernism and classical tradition. It seeks a mediation between the Novecento and the dynamic trust of futurism. It refused the classical designers and the principle of the vittorious style advocated by Marcello Piacentini, who was the architect of the regime. Initially supported by Mussolini, the rationalists, who also intended to offer a form of new architecture that reflected the fascist principles, were then opposed. Perhaps they were too naive to realize what fascism really was in Mussolini's intentions. The simplified neoclassicism of Piacentini was judged more appropriate for the purpose of the regime. So fascism conditioned the development of rationalism that was not unharmed by a certain compromise. But unlike what happened in Russia or in Nazi Germany, in Italy fascism did not strictly dictate the requirements for a regime art. Mussolini sought to transmit the spirit of fascism and the corresponding lifestyle, even through art. So he tried to obtain consent by giving visibility to the artists, flattering them with prizes and awards, asking for their involvement in order to create a functional collective image for his regime. At least until 1937, when the anti-Semitic campaign began and things changed. And I would like to remember that we are approaching the 18th anniversary in Italy of the passing of the anti-Semitic racial laws, sadly. So we can observe in Italy 2 coexisting trends, both characterized by the reference to a classical tradition, but in a different manner. The first one, the editorial style, is embodied by a simplified and monumental neoclassicism, indulgent with the demands of the regime. The other is devoted to an ideal classicism and more related to the functionality and technology as called for European modernism. If the first one interprets classicism in purely formal terms, the other takes it as a spiritual quality. As you can see in the Casa del Fascio, designed by Giuseppe Terragni, on the left, here compared to a editorial style building on the right. And this building opposes the official monumentalism and the rhetoric of the regime. And it's another way of interpreting the relation with history and mankind, seeking a human scale, a human size in architecture. Terrani creates a courtyard building with a square floor, like the blocks of Como founded by the Romans, and it seeks a dialogue with historical monuments. So here are two the peculiar elements of Italian rationalism: the attention to history and the interpretation of architecture as a narrative. This is in the urban context. So the difference between the two trends is not always so clear, and we can notice in the University campus La Sapienza, built in Rome between 1932 and 1935 upon Marcello Piacentini's project. The plan is developed into a Latin cross basilical style, where the various buildings made of reinforced cement are balanced, although they're not identical. Following the guidelines of magnificence and reference to ancient Rome, the work designed by Piacentini expresses the elitary style, but it's contradicted by the solutions introduced by a few of the 9 architects involved by Piacentini himself. This is by Piacentini, and this is, for example, the Botanical Institute by Giuseppe Capponi. This is set apart from the neoclassicism and therefore from any stylish formal bond with the antique. He found inspiration beyond the Alps, in particular as far as the choice of the clinker bricks cladding, tiled in lithoceramica, widely used in Germany and the Netherlands. That was definitely a non-conventional choice. Note that the 20s, the return to clay brick, clearly bonded with the archetypes of Roman architecture, wasn't only the reiteration of the monumental style, but was also a meditative linguistic update, even if still in the trail of the classical tradition. So particular from Capponi. Starting from 1934, rationalism presence begins to decline and is overtaken by the elitary style prevalent in public tenders. The regime instead insisted on the monumental function of buildings, on the use of stone or marble travertine, on a language that would have an impressive effect on the minds. And during this period, Mussolini launches his idea for creating the Third Rome, expanding the city towards the east and west starts towards the sea. The EUR district, acronym for Universal Exposition Rome of 1942, called E42 project, was the first step to connect Rome and the coast. The original plan, inspired by the classical Roman city planning with a few elements of rationalism, envisaged a development based on orthogonal axes and solid square architectural buildings, mainly in white marbles and travertine. That brings us back immediately to antiquity. And this style called metaphysical rationalism, and is basically expressing an oversimplified classicism. So the building that mainly symbolizes this architectural model is Palazzo della Civiltà Italiana, also called the Square Colosseum. Although based on modernity, the whole complex is, for obvious propaganda reasons, over-rhetorical if compared to other contemporary Italian architecture. It should be noted that the 4 architects involved with Piacentini in the EUR projects were rationalists. Nevertheless, they all had to compromise with Piacentini's neoclassical vision at last. But the World War II interrupted the project that was resumed only in 1951. And in the 60s, Europe was a modern district quite different from the monumental and rhetorical modernity imagined by fascism. Now something about, this is an aerial view in the 60s. Something about art and decoration that had a fundamental role at time. Most of the buildings and artworks manifested political fissures that were unacceptable in the new democratic post-war era. As it was, for example, the majestic fresco of Mario Sironi, Italy between art and science, in the auditorium of the University La Sapienza. It witnesses the union between politics and culture. In Sironi's intentions, the gigantic mural had to embody the values of fascist society. His archaic, monumental, and austere style attempted a synthesis of modernism and fascism. As expression of art enslaved to the regime, in 1950 the mural was remodeled and partly covered, as you can see in this image on the right. And this restoration aimed at weakening the stylistic matrix of the work, at defascistize it, by softening the traits, modifying the use, and concealing the symbols of the regime, eagles, fascists, and so on. Condemned to oblivion for a long time, this artwork has recently been recovered by a philological restoration that has been launched according to the principle of freedom of expression and the law on copyright. So we could say that it enhances the artistic value to the detriment of its political relevance. This initiative is part of a broader campaign of re-evaluation and recovery of the artistic production during the 2 decades of fascist rule. About that, opened last February at Prada Foundation in Milan, the exhibition Post Sanctum Tuum Art Politics, Italia 1918-1943, represents a good basis to deepen the link between politics and culture in the interwar years, and to observe the way in which artworks and exhibitions were received by the public of the time. The exhibition design that might first appear obsolete is especially made to recreate the original conditions of public and private shows in order to investigate the concept of exhibition as a political form. Many documents of the time are displayed as publication, architectural designs, original images. Among the others, the major designs for the E42 projected are presented. The role of art and architecture in the reconfiguration of an Italian cultural identity is one of the most interesting points investigated in this exhibition. In general, exhibitions were considered a powerful propaganda tools for the regime as part of a strategy of aestheticization of politics. The exhibition of national products and images was used as a flexible, modern, and practical means for reshaping Italian people and molding their experience of the world. It reveals how subtle and ambiguous the policies of the regime were until 1937. This attitude allows the intellectuals, the artists, the architects, a certain autonomy by participating or criticizing the regime. And on one hand, this ambiguity was functional to building the consensus. On the other hand, it was a consequence of the cult of the individual expression that Mussolini stood for. Maybe it's a structural feature of fascism that was a complex entity. Indeed, it's not without reason defined by historians as an anomalous dictatorship, an imperfect totalitarianism. This exhibition also highlights the dialogue between the private bourgeois and the public dimensions through the architectural monumental projects. Having to give his own imprint in a country strongly marked by a glorious past in art and architecture, Mussolini was understandably more careful to the public housing projects, while conceded to the private more creative freedom. This has allowed the spread of a certain eclecticism in private architecture with inspiration to the liberty, rationalism, Novecento, and late Baroque in Rome. But I refer you about that to Camilla Borghesi's speech that will be tomorrow and to her exhibition. The topic of the relation with the historical, cultural, and architectural heritage of the fascist era is far from being over in Italy. Around 1945, here had been defined as a monument to national silliness. However, lately, there is a general reassessment under the technical and aesthetical aspect. It's most probably due to the historical gap and also to the end of the big narrations that the ideological aspect of these places has been weakened. In the last 15 years, the revaluation of Piacentini's neoclassicism has opened again the debate extended to politics, culture, and to the public opinion. Someone encouraged rightly not to mix fascist architecture and architecture built throughout fascism. So the confusion came because, despite of official style, fascism tolerated at least until 1937 the use of other languages I mentioned above. At the time, various rationalists had already realized that it was impossible to put together a human-based architecture, like the Rationalizmas one, for example, with the fascism of the superhuman. In 2015, someone was encouraging to remove the word dux from the obelisk of the Foro Italico in Rome. Recently, the Italian public TV broadcasted a program on fascist architecture with great success. Almost in the meantime, the daily newspaper Sole 24 Ore launched a survey on the public perception on the dispute arising from an article published on the website of the magazine New Yorker. In this article, the author, Ruth Benguiat, professor of history and Italian studies at New York University, introduced the query on the on the persistence of fascist symbols in Italy and launched the historical topic regarding the memory of fascism. Many readers of the Sole 24 Ore seem to reject the ideological reading that would not produce objective visions. For many people, the Italian rationalist style represents one of the highest points of the national architecture, and that's enough. It's not perceived as an expression of the fascist regime. Therefore, the need to separate the concept of fascism from that of rationalist architecture prevailed, even if the difference between fascist architecture and architecture built throughout fascism is not always clear to the public. Another point is the difference between commemorative monuments and works of civil architecture that, because most of the buildings still standing today, have above all a urban architectural value and function. Then there is the idea that handing down the artistic and cultural heritage is different from defending the moral heritage. So we cannot delete history falling headlong upon architecture or art. On the contrary, keeping alive the memory of 20 years of history, which has led us to where we are today, could be a good way for not forgetting and avoiding repeating the same mistakes. Immediately after the war, the proposal to demolish the obelisk of the Foro Italico in Rome fell on deaf ears, officially for economic reasons. The topic reappeared during the organization of the Olympic Games in 1960, and in that occasion, an effort was made to remove cautiously as many explicit symbols as possible of the glorification of the regime, but not its memory. Such notion was pursued also afterwards. As a result, the obelisk inscriptions and fasces still exist today, mixed with other symbols of the long history of this country, where their presence is almost unnoticed in everyday life. But we have a public drinking fountain. So, nevertheless, the problem of dealing with an old issue persists in the awareness of the difference between memory and nostalgic celebration. The question is if those symbols can really be ideologically restored, and if they can actually resume their active role in the propaganda. Historian Emilio Gentile outlines that Mussolini wanted to create an efficient system of symbols with a religious value in order to strengthen his power. Therefore, it would be necessary to work on the symbolic system, on the awareness, and on the transmission of the images without falling into the liberation anxiety that goes through removal or destruction of their diffusion media, transmission vehicles, and not through the elimination of the images in the social imaginary. The iconoclastic result is a clear surrounding, in my opinion, to the image symbolic power so as to lead to a dangerous acceptance of violence as the only possible way out. So finally, I propose you a smart alternative in the last image, an artwork realized by artists Arnold Osnek and Michele Bernardi that transforms a rhetorical phrase into a place of memory. That's a case of resemantization. I think very interesting. Well, I conclude. Thank you.